Hi everyone, my plants and I are back. Today I wanted to fill you in on what I've been up to for the past year. So most of you may have known that I graduated in 2021 and I've been applying to medical school over the past year. I thought it'd be helpful to share some ideas for what you can do during your gap year before medical school and the process of me deciding what I wanted to personally do given my previous experiences. So the medical school application opens up in around May before my gap year had started. And so when I was thinking about what I wanted to do during my gap year, I was thinking about what prior experiences I already had and then what my application could be strengthened by. And so for me, I had a lot of prior research experience and I wanted to get more clinical exposure, especially because I was in school when the pandemic had started and so I wasn't able to have as much clinical experience. So I'm going to first talk about what I ended up deciding to do, which was part-time medical scribing, working as an MCAT tutor, and also volunteering. So as I mentioned before, I was really looking for clinical experience. And so I was looking at options like being a medical assistant and working as a medical scribe as my main options. It ended up being easier for me to look for medical scribe positions because medical assistants tend to require certification. Also, if you're interested in being an EMT, I think it's a great experience to do while you're an undergrad because there's more of a pipeline to do that with training. It's a lot more difficult, I think, to get certification once you've graduated. But I'd highly recommend looking for those clinical experiences early on in your pre-med sort of career, whether it's being an EMT, scribing, or doing more sort of involved clinical internships rather than passive volunteering and shadowing. Although those experiences can also be very informative in deciding that you want to go into medicine. Scribing ended up being a really incredible experience in terms of learning more about medicine and how a hospital actually functions day to day. And so as a medical scribe in the emergency department, I was able to learn from physicians and how they treated a wide diversity of patients. For instance, folks who came in for like a heart attack or who had more longitudinal chronic health problems, as well as patients who were in for non-medical reasons, for instance, physical assault, not having safe housing or food conditions. And so I think because of that, scribing the emergency department is a really good way to get exposure to medicine as an overall field. As a medical scribe, you're primarily responsible for documentation of patient visits, so you'll learn how to write an HPI, which is the history of present illness, essentially the story of why the patient is coming into the ED, learning how to communicate and document a patient's past medical history, the reason for visiting, and any other relevant context is really helpful for eventually when you go into medical school and have to interview your own patients. If you are working as a medical scribe through a major company like Scribe America, most likely you're going to be working part-time and it's shift-based. So you'll be working usually around like 8-hour shifts. Sometimes they can be overnight, anywhere between 2 to around 4 times a week, I think. Obviously, you can take more or less shifts depending on your schedule, and I like that it's really flexible in that way. But because of that, I recommend also working another part-time job. A caveat I would like to add, though, is that if you are working during your gap year to save up for medical school, which I think we all are, scribing is definitely not the most lucrative option. Most likely, if you're working as a medical scribe, you'll probably be making your state's minimum wage. So that's definitely something to keep in mind when you're looking at your job options for your gap year. That brings me to working as an MCAT tutor as my other part-time job. I worked as an MCAT tutor with a major test prep company and had a really good experience overall. It was really flexible in that I scheduled directly with my own students, and I learned a lot about not only how to teach, but I also came to realize that working as a tutor is helping students through a really high-stress period of their academic career. If you're interested in working as an MCAT tutor for a major test prep company, they probably will have a score cutoff as a qualification, so what you got on your MCAT. Just to reiterate, it was a great experience. It definitely works well with my schedule and it paid a lot better than scribing. The last thing that I worked on during my gap year was definitely less of a time commitment, and it was a volunteer program. I was working with a physician at a local hospital in the Bay Area to start a narrative medicine program where we interviewed patients about their first-person experience of their illness and navigating the healthcare system at large. After interviewing them, I would help write a one-page sort of story about their life experiences and anything they want to share with their care team, input that document into their healthcare record, and then share that with their physicians. And so this was a really rewarding experience for me as someone who's really interested in creative writing, who's interested in storytelling, and also interested in helping improve patient care, for me to combine all of those interests into one through this volunteer program. So if you're interested in that, it's called My Life, My Story, and there are definitely a lot of chapters in VAs across the United States that you can probably get involved in. Just to talk briefly about research, if that's what you're interested in doing during your gap year. If you haven't done research during your undergrad experience, I highly recommend trying it. It's a really awesome way to get involved in a specialty interest, for instance, that you weren't able to explore in your classwork. Totally forgot to mention, I applied for a Fulbright, and I would have done that if I gotten it. I ended up being a semi-finalist, but there was only one spot for my country, so didn't end up getting that one spot. But I would highly recommend applying for a research fellowship. Just go for it, because it's a great opportunity for you to ask people for letters of recommendation who you might eventually ask for your medical school letters of recommendation. This way you'll have an idea of which professors are reliable and willing to help you with your application process. Then when you apply for medical school, they'll already have a draft ready that they can make some minor revisions to and cater it more towards medical schools and send off on your behalf. An additional benefit of applying for a research fellowship, for instance, is that there might be a lot of overlap between your research interests and your reasons for going to medical school. And so your statement of purpose or your personal statement for that fellowship might end up being a draft for your medical school personal statement, which it was for me. And so it's just a way for you to get started on the application process and make it less daunting for you. So I would highly recommend. It was something that I was considering not even applying for, because I was like, oh no, it's such a small probability that I'll get this fellowship, but you'd be happily surprised. So go for it if you're considering it. One thing I'd like to note though is that if your goal is publication, that can take a really long time. So if you are applying that year and then just starting your research, it's really hard to get published within that time frame, especially before interviews. And so your goal should really be to gain research experience, to perhaps present your abstract at a conference or make a poster presentation. But it's pretty unlikely that you'll get an actual paper published in that time frame of less than a year. For example, I was working on my thesis in my senior year in undergrad, and it only got published around January when I was interviewing this past cycle. So sometimes it can take like 6 months just to hear back from editors after you submitted your paper. That's just something to be cognizant of in case you are interested in publication. More generally, something I wanted to note is that if you are taking your gap year for additional experience that you want to put on your application, if you're planning on only taking one gap year and you're applying for medical schools at the same time like I did, you'll only have had a few months maybe of experience before you begin to have interviews. So that's something that I wasn't aware of initially, is that I wouldn't have had a lot of experience to talk about in my secondary essays at that point, because I've only been in that position of, let's say, a medical scribe for a few weeks or a few months. One way to work around this is on your primary application, you can project hours within some activity. And so I had put medical scribe on my primary application under the activity section and said I would have X amount of hours by the end of my gap year. In that activity description, you can then talk about why you chose to pursue X activity and what you hope to learn from it and how that will serve you in your future career as a physician. I want to end off on some other inspiration for things that you could do during your gap year. I was interested in applying for medical education sort of tech startups when I was looking at gap year positions, and I interviewed at a few companies. If you have a business venture or some creative interest that you've always wanted to pursue but haven't had the time to do, you could always do part-time like clinical experiences and also work on a business venture at the same time. I think something that is frequently asked is, can I pursue something that is not super medically related during my gap year if this is sort of the only opportunity that I'll have to do this? And I would say, yes, you can totally go for it, but just prepare an answer for why you chose to do that activity in lieu of something that is more medically related. Or you can also do a medically related volunteer experience that is less time commitment, but continues to show your longitudinal interest within medicine. Just to wrap up, I think as long as you pursue something that you're genuinely passionate about and or something that can serve to fill a gap in your application, you should be totally fine. A good litmus test for deciding what to pursue throughout my undergraduate career has been thinking about, if someone were to ask me about this experience, would I be able to provide a meaningful and reflective response on why I really care about that activity? If you're able to provide an answer to that, then I think that's something you should definitely go forth with, and if not, then it might be something that you reconsider. In terms of the future of this YouTube channel, I actually have a ton of videos planned for my entire medical school application process and sharing what I've learned through this past year. That being said, if you have any suggestions for questions you might want answered in terms of applying to medical school, being pre-med in general, please feel free to leave a comment and I will try and get to it. Alright, take care everyone. Bye!